I had an affair with someone before my husband's family gathering. I feel so guilty about it, even though I know it was wrong. I gave in to temptation, and it felt so good. I'm the only one to blame for where I am now. Have any of you been in a similar situation? How did you handle it? I know I messed up, and I can't undo it. I'm 40 and have been married to my husband, who is 46, for 12 years. My husband Dan works for a marketing agency, and I'm a housewife. We have 2 boys, aged 10 and 8. I met my husband 15 years ago. I was a waitress at a restaurant bar that was really popular at the time. He used to visit regularly with his friends, and I always found him very attractive. He always made a point of sitting in my booth. One time the other waitress tried to serve him, but he refused and asked for me. I waited for him to make a move, but nothing. One day, I thought I'd ask him out myself. He beat me to it, though he was my last customer that evening after my shift. When my shift was over, I came out to find him waiting for me. He asked me for my number, and a few days later, he texted me, asking me out on a date. I said yes, and we dated for 3 years before we decided we should get married. Our marriage was everything one could dream of. I worked for a little while after that. After we got married, I stopped working when I got pregnant with my eldest son. I've been a housewife ever since. My family life has been great. My friends always say they're jealous of me. My husband loved me. We had 2 wonderful children. It was a dream life until my husband travels a lot for work, so I had to go along with it. It wasn't much of a deal since I always had the boys, and was never left alone, even when I wanted to. My boys went to boarding school this summer, which I wasn't happy about, but it was a tradition in my in-laws' family. My husband's family. And I started feeling lonely after my boys went to boarding school this summer. My husband was away on work trips, and my friends were busy with their own lives. It also started to feel really boring. I thought about joining some classes. It was the best way to pass the time. I looked at some classes near me and finally decided that I should join art classes. I've always had an interest in art. I used to do art at school, but never had the time to continue. Now I had all the time in the world. I went to the website of this art class near me and saw that an artist in his 30 seconds was running it. I filled in the forms and enrolled. I started in the evening when Dan and I were having dinner. I told him I was joining an art class. He was really happy for me. He always says you should explore your hobbies. I was really happy to tell him that I'd won the lottery for the best husband. He was always so supportive. The day for my first class finally came, and I went there. I was quite nervous at the age of 40. Starting something new felt quite intimidating, but Dan was right. I needed to explore this for me. I thought as I looked in the mirror. I wore a white sundress. I didn't want to look too uptight. I finally reached the place was a studio, not too big and not too small. It was a good spot. I was the first one there, so I checked out the interior and everything. There was a full-length mirror on one of the walls. Whoever designed the interior of this place had a good choice. I found something I liked. My voice broke, and I turned to look. There was a young man standing near the door. He smiled at me, and I gave him a small smile in return. "I'm John, your teacher." He introduced himself. This young man was going to teach me art. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. I introduced myself to him as well. John smiled at me and told me to take a seat. I asked him if there were going to be other people there. He told me that I was the only one in the class. He said that he only takes one-on-one classes. I must have missed that on the website. JN started explaining the basics to me. He told me what objects we would cover and so on. There was something about JN that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but he gave me a different energy. He would give me complete attention. I was the only person in the studio, but he looked at me like I was special, which felt weird. I enjoyed it a bit when I was drawing or painting though. JN would come and sit closer to me. He got really close to me a few times. He would hold my hands and show me where I was going wrong. It didn't feel like a normal teaching equation, but I couldn't tell him to maintain some distance. I didn't want to. I always looked forward to going to the studio, even though I had scheduled classes twice a week. JN had told me that I was always welcome here to hang out or to draw something whenever I used to visit the studio. JN would always treat me with such warmth and gentleness. It felt good, even though it also felt wrong to receive this type of attention from a stranger. It felt wrong to receive this type of attention from a stranger when I had a loving husband back home. Dan had gone out of town for work, so I thought that instead of being alone at home, I should head to the studio. I got ready, putting on a bit more makeup than I would have normally done. I picked a cute dress and also applied my favorite red lipstick. I told myself I was doing it for me, but part of me knew that there was more to it. I went to the studio and found John there. He was surprised to see me. I told him that I wanted to drop something off if that was okay with him. He said it was fine, so we both took our seats. I was so engrossed in the piece I was working on that I didn't realize when John came and stood behind me. It was only when he placed his hands on my shoulders that I looked up at him. He said, "Oh, thank you. It isn't finished yet." I thanked him and then he said, "That piece is great, but I was talking about you. You look beautiful tonight." I was stunned. I guess I told him quietly. I guess I started feeling nervous suddenly, even though I had a crush on you, as the kids today call it. It still felt inappropriate. JN took my sketchbook from my hand and kept it on the side. He started massaging my shoulders. I whispered, "What are you doing?" My voice was shaky. "Just give me a massage, relax your shoulders for me." I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, or if his voice was more husky than normal. I told him it wasn't appropriate, but he kept going. His hands went to my back. I haven't been intimate with Dan lately. He's always been busy with work, and I've been busy with the kids. We haven't spent much time together. We don't get to spend much time together like that anymore, so as JN kept massaging me, I realized that I missed it. When I was getting it, I didn't want it to end. I made a big mistake. I went to his home with him. My conscience knew that I was doing the wrong thing, but desire took over and conscience died. Don't get disgusted, but John gave me something I was missing. The way he touched me aroused the desire. I slept with him. I went back to his place the next morning while he was still asleep. I couldn't look at anyone. I felt awful. John kept telling me how much he wanted more time with me, but I felt guilty. I had memories of my family when I got home. My guilt increased. I told myself I have a loving husband, and I have a wonderful family. I shouldn't make such decisions. I did my household work and decided that I will never set foot in that studio again. My thoughts were interrupted when I got a call from John. "Why did you leave like that?" he asked. I told him that what happened between us can never happen again. He refused to let it go. "If I don't go back to your house," he said, "he will come to mine." I was pretty sure he had my address from the info I put in the form when I joined his classes. I didn't want him to come to my home. I didn't want my neighbors to see him and ask questions. I didn't want to risk something like that, so I decided to go to his house and tell him face to face that whatever happened between us can never happen again. I reached John's house at 8 sharp. I was ready to tell him my decision, but when he opened the door and kissed me, I melted. I wasn't used to this level of urgency and passion, and it felt incredible. I feel awful for that. JN treated me with such warmth, but at the same time he used to treat me with so much passion. I missed this passion with my husband. It was there at the beginning, but as responsibilities increased, John told me that I could have it now, but I knew that I should leave. I stayed anyway, thinking that I would give myself one more night and then leave. The next morning John woke up before me. When I asked him how he was up so early, he brought me coffee and put my hair behind my ears in a soft touch. I know what he meant. "You feel guilty about this, but you don't have to," he told me. He explained to me how we all need something in our life to have some fun. "It's not right," I told him. He kissed me and asked if it felt wrong to me. I couldn't say yes. Being with John felt right in some way. He gave me passion and urgency. Maybe he was right and I did need it. I was always the dutiful wife and the good mother. I thought, why not? Just for a little while. I told John that if we agreed to continue this, we'd have to be secretive about it. We came to an agreement on how we'd meet on days when Dan would be out of town for work. Dan wouldn't even notice. I left John's house. I went home and cleaned up a bit. I also made dinner for Dan. He got back around 7 p.m. We were eating when he told me his mum's birthday was coming up and they were having a party at their villa. My mum's-in-law's birthday is always a big deal. The whole family gets together to celebrate, and everyone loves it because it's one of the few times the whole family gets together. I told him I'd get her birthday gifts soon, on the day of the family gathering. When the time came for the gathering, I hadn't met John for over a week. By that time, I'd received a message from him in the morning saying he wanted to meet me. I told him I couldn't meet that day as I had to go to a family event. He kept insisting I go to his house, even for a little while. He was so persistent that I gave in and told him I'd be there. I made an excuse to Dan that I'd forgotten to pick the birthday gift. He was so persistent that I gave in and told him I'd be there. I made an excuse to Dan that I'd forgotten to pick the birthday gift. I went to John's house straight away. As soon as I got there, he started kissing me. I kissed him back and we went to his bed. After an hour, I realized that I had to dash back home as I needed to go to my in-laws' house as well. I got back to my house and Dan arrived 10 minutes later. We got ready and went to their place. Dan told me that I looked really beautiful, but I felt guilty. I smiled at him, but I felt awful. The evening was amazing, and I enjoyed spending time with all of my in-laws. Laws are really warm and kind to me. They've always been kind to me since the beginning of my relationship with JN. My mother-in-law is. My mother-in-law told me she was happy to see me, and that she was happy with me. She has always been like a mother to me. She being happy for us made me feel really bad about what I'm doing with her son. We came back from their house and I was really guilty. I didn't realize it when I started crying. Dan asked me what was wrong. I told him that I missed the boys. It felt weird lying to the man I have spent 15 years of my life with. I felt really guilty. I was consumed by it, and decided I was never going to see John again. It felt good to give in to temptation, but I couldn't hurt Dan. I stopped texting John and picking up his calls. I thought everything was going to get better, but I couldn't have been more wrong. One day, I opened my text messages and saw intimate pictures of me and John. The pictures were taken from an angle where it was clear that it was me. John had sent them to me. He asked me to pay $50. I was at a loss. He said he'd send the pictures to my husband unless I paid him $500. I was furious. How could he do this to me? But I was the one who'd made the mistake of trusting a stranger. I'd been naive. Now I was in a difficult position. I didn't have the money he was asking for, and I didn't want those pictures to hurt my family. I was at a loss as to what to do. I'd appreciate any suggestions from anyone reading this. Please leave them in the comments. I could really do with some help. It's been more than 6 months now. JN has been blackmailing me. As someone said in the comments, I told him I wasn't scared of him and I'd take him to the police if he kept harassing me. It didn't work because he knew he'd found my weakness. I couldn't give him that much money even if I wanted to, because I didn't have it. If I'd asked Dan, he'd have said no. For such a large sum of money, he would have realized something was going on. I asked John to give me some time to figure something out, but he didn't listen. He sent those pictures to my house to scare me. He probably thought I would be scared and give him the money instantly, but instead, Dan found that envelope. He was home early from work while I was at the grocery store. When I got home, I found him sitting with the envelope in front of him. I didn't understand what was going on, but one look at his face told me everything. I didn't even need to see the envelope, but I did. I'd had enough lying, so I told Dan the complete truth. I told him how guilty I felt and begged him for forgiveness, but he wasn't having any of it. He didn't show any emotion. He left the house shortly after that. I stayed awake waiting for him, but he never came back home. I texted him to ask where he was. He wasn't picking up my calls or answering my texts. I contacted his friends, but no one knew where he went. I just received a text from him the next morning to never contact him again. It was like my whole life had crumbled in front of me. It hurt a lot. I knew I was to blame for it, but 2 days later I got divorce papers from our lawyers. Dan had requested full custody of the boys. I called him up and was grateful when he picked up. I begged him not to do this and asked him not to take the kids away from me. I can't let them get raised by a woman I hate so much. He said he'd never spoken to me like this in all these years. I knew I'd lost the battle and there was nothing I could do to salvage it. I got a call from the lawyers telling me to leave the house by the next morning as it was legally Dan's property. John called me once again trying to scare me, but I told him that I'd already lost everything and to get lost. It felt slightly better. My sons refused to talk to me as well. Dan must have told them what had happened. I guess it's no surprise that they hate me too. I left the house in tears and have been living with my parents, who also don't talk to me. They've told me to find a place for myself as soon as possible. To anyone reading my story, I just want to say that even though giving in to temptation feels so good, don't let your conscience die. I made that mistake, and there isn't a moment in my life when I don't regret it.